Hey everybody, thanks for coming along. My name's Ciarán Quinn, so I'm the Research Support Librarian in Maynooth University. So I'm just going to talk to you, I suppose, relatively quickly about open access. And I suppose my approach to it is really just, I suppose, first of all, how to go about what kind of would be the options for publishing open access, and then some of the, I suppose, things you might want to think about when you're publishing open access. So hopefully that'll cover. And I said there'll be time for questions at the end. So if you have any questions, store them up, and we'll have a few minutes at the end to hopefully be able to resolve some of those. So I suppose firstly, open access. I suppose most of us kind of know a bit about open access at this stage, but the idea of it is it's going to be free, unrestricted online access to your articles. I could also cover things like books and dissertations and so on, but I'm just going to look at journals specifically. And there will be two, I suppose, main routes, traditionally at least, into open access. There will be the gold open access route, which I'll talk a bit about, and that's basically, I suppose, where you pay an article processing charge with a publisher, and that makes your article freely available to everybody. And that's actually as opposed to, for example, going through a paywall through a university subscription. And the other option would be the green open access, and that would typically involve an open access repository. So in the case of Maynooth, that would be Mural, which is the Maynooth University Institution repository, where people would deposit their articles, their dissertations, and various other types of information. So they're the kind of two, I suppose, main options you might come across. So the green version is just that's a published article in a traditional subscription journal, and then you might put it in a repository, and that's often called self-archiving. And in a lot of cases, just to, I suppose, resolve copyright issues, that would be maybe a version of the article. So it might be the the version that was accepted, but not the final version, or it might be a preprint, it might be a post-print of the article, but maybe something that would be different to the final accepted version of your article. Say in that case, there might be restrictions. And then there's the gold open access. So the full gold open access is where the articles are freely available to readers immediately without restrictions. And this is typically where there's a subscription involved. So you would pay an article processing charge, and then open access is available as gold open access. And then a variant on that would be the hybrid golden open access. And this is where you'd often see it in a journal where some of the articles are available open access and some of them are behind a paywall. And that's obviously where some of the authors would pay the article processing charge, and then everybody's able to access their articles, and other ones would still be restricted behind the paywall. Okay. And another option could be publishing your own journal, and this is a thing that's kind of developing in Maynooth. So we have a few. I just shown you two of them here. There's another one then for the Kennedy Institute as well. So, for example, the Open Journal of Astrophysics is published by Peter Coles, and that's using this Scholastica software. And then the Journal of Military and History and Defence Studies is by the Ian Speller in the History Department, and that's published using the Open Journal system. And there was actually a talk on that yesterday, so if you're interested in that, you could probably go back and see the recorded versions of that. But again, that is always an option if you find, you want to publish in a certain area. Current journals aren't really representing what you're interested in publishing. It's never been easier, I think, to probably publish your own journal. And if you're interested in that, you could contact our department about that. Okay, and that'd be Fiona Morley you could contact to talk about that. Okay. So open access publishing agreements. So this is a thing that's, I suppose, developed fairly recently. So for example, in the case of Maynooth, through IRL, we would have agreements with a number of publishers. And the idea of that is, I suppose, bundled up with your subscriptions, you will also get your articles made available open access. And I think that's based around, where Maynooth academics will currently be publishing. So that's quite a nice way to avoid the article processing charges with certain publishers. But there's a lot of, those terms and conditions with that. You need to investigate exactly what is covered, whether it covers the journal that you intend to write in. But a great development, means you won't be paying article processing charges, so well worth investigating that. Okay, and these are just some of the IRL requirements on that. So as I mentioned, the idea of the agreement is that it covers the read costs, which is typically what the library would have paid, for users to view the articles, and the publication costs. It's all wrapped up in the one bundle. Okay, and the articles should be made available open access immediately. Okay, and this would include hybrid titles. Now, if you want to check copyright issues, so if you're intending to self-archive your work, this site is quite useful. It's called Sherpa Romeo, and you can actually go in by journal title or by publisher and just see what are the terms and conditions under which you can, self-archive your work. So maybe there might be, a delay that you can't put the final published version open access for a few years, or 6 months, whatever it is, or you might be required to put an alternative version of it in the institution repository. Okay. Now, other options for finding open access titles. So if you want to, for example, find out which are the open access titles and decide that you want to publish in them, you have a few different options there. So there's the Directory of Open Access Journals, the DOAJ, so that's quite useful. It's a pretty comprehensive list. And of course, because it's a proper list, there will be certain quality controls on that, so you'd have a good sense that they would be good quality journals. You could also try Scopus or Web of Science. And if you're not familiar with these would be kind of the major, I suppose, bibliographic databases. So these are the ones that would do, index huge numbers of journals and track citations and so on them. Now, just if you're looking in those, they're only indexing gold open access journals. So they'll be the ones you'd have to pay an article processing charge to get into them, unless they're included in the agreements I just mentioned. Whereas the DOAJ will be a more comprehensive list. This will include the non-gold ones as well. Then there are certain open access publishers that you could publish with. Usually there's a fee involved with those, but you could check that out. So these things like Biomed Central, PLOS will be another popular one. So you can investigate those, but they're specialized and they're purely open access publishers. Okay. Then other ones might be some that they are traditional journals in the sense that they're, a subscription fee, but they also produce open access titles. That includes like BMJ Open, Sage Open, Nature Communications. So if you're in the science field, and you'll notice this, and I'll talk about this a bit later, that it's something that I think is much more developed, I suppose, in the sciences than it would be in the humanities, for example. But having said that, there are things developing. So for example, the Open Library of Humanities, you could have a look in there for titles. Okay, and there's some good details on this actually there's a LibGuide in UCD that talks a lot about open access in humanities you could have a look at. Then there are directories of open access repositories. So this could give you other options as well. So if you wanted to deposit your work in a more subject-based repository, for example, you could do that. And a lot, again, particularly in the sciences, there'll be long traditions of depositing your open access articles in certain subject repositories. You could have a look at those. So DOAR and ROR would be another one you could have a look at. So just to mention in passing as well, a thing that has grown, I suppose, on the back of all this kind of increase in open access is the predatory journals. And you kind of be aware of those, typically, I suppose, if you maybe speak at a conference and the next thing you're getting emails, full of lovely compliments telling you how amazing you are and that they'd really like you to, write for their journal or attend their conferences or speak at their conferences. And typically they'll be looking, I suppose they'll guarantee, a quick turnaround, we'll have you published within a couple of weeks. And for a small fee, we can make your work available open access. But just be careful around these because they typically they are for profit. And really what they're trying to do is get your articles, which will again be disseminated for, I suppose, profit at their end. So just be careful around those and check carefully if you're not familiar with the title, if you're not quite sure if they're legitimate. There's various places you could check the titles of the journals, and even down to who's publishing it, who the editorial board is, all that kind of stuff. It might give you clues of whether it's legitimate or not. But there are some handy tools for that. For example, Think, Check, Submit is a piece of software that you can go in and it can help you identify trusted journals for your research. So that's well worth having a look at, and you just click through on that and it'll bring you through how to approach publishing open access. There's a list called Beale's List, and this guy he's a librarian from the US, and he was producing a list of predatory journals, but due to litigation he's had to stop doing that, but the list is still available. So if you want to consult that, and I think it is being sort of updated independently, but you will find that online, and there's a link there for that. Ulrichs, so this will be the traditional go-to. So this is the worldwide directory of journal titles. So again, just go in and have a look and see if the journal appears on Ulrichs. If it's not there, you might have question marks around it. But you could also do things like check some of the major databases. So for example, Web of Science, Scopus, EBSCO. Just have a look and see if the journal is actually listed in there, because these would be major databases. So again, particularly if it's a big international journal, it's pretty likely it's going to be indexed on these databases. Then you'll also, depending on your subject area, you might have more specific lists. For example, the Association of Business Schools, they would have a listing of business journals. So you might have, more subject-specific listings that you could look at as well. Okay. So open access requirements. So just, I suppose, quickly on this, there is, I suppose the pros of open access are, it's great. You're sharing your research to a huge audience. It's available to anybody worldwide. You're getting into that whole thing of sharing your scholarship, which probably is what, academia should be about. But there's also, so that should be, I suppose, the pros thing. There's also a push factor that a lot of funders now who are dispensing public money are requiring that you make your work available open access. So, for example, Horizon funding, Horizon 2020, they started off with a pilot scheme, but they're now requiring that your work is published open access and also that your data is available open access. And it's specifying that an electronic copy of a publication must be deposited in a suitable green open access repository. A version of the paper will generally be the author's postprint or author's final version of the article after the refereeing process has taken place. If a gold open access route is chosen, a copy must also be self-archived in a repository to ensure long-term preservation of the article. Okay, so very important and that's something that will be spelled out to, if you're getting funding from a certain source, you'll see that in the requirements, that it is a requirement that you must deposit your article open access. Okay. And this is another thing that's pushing this thing called Plan S. And this is something that was launched in September 2018. Actually, there's a good talk on that yesterday as well. If you look at the recorded talks, you'll find Plan S mentioned. And that was actually a talk on Opal journal systems that was on yesterday. You could have a look at that. Anyway, it requires that from 2020, it's now been deferred to 21, scientific publications that result from research funded by public grants must be published in compliance open access journals or platforms. And again, you could check in the Sherpa website to see how you can do that. And funders that are currently supporting Plan S include, not exclusively, there's more, Science Foundation Ireland, World Health Organization, UK Research and Innovation, and the Wellcome Trust. So a lot of them are on board with this. And it is that sense that, if research is funded publicly, that it should be available, rather than, again, be behind a paywall and then public institutions have to pay to get it back, the so-called double dip. Plan S compliance. So 3 main routes. You deposit versions of the record or the author accepted manuscript in open access, possibly the ones without embargo and licensed for Creative Commons. Okay, or you're in a hybrid journal and only under transformative agreements. So they're the agreements I mentioned earlier. So where deals have been made, so you can make that available open access. Okay. And again, actually, I should have, I'll just go back a bit on that very quickly. Again, that open UCD guide will have that, and the Maynooth guide as well covers that. So just getting into some of the benefits of open access, this is just some of them that Spark Europe have mentioned. So things like, for example, you're increasing your audience, so that's great. So you go to the trouble of doing your research, getting published, it's important that it's read as widely as possible. So that's a good benefit. The research is going to benefit. Again, you're a researcher, maybe you're an independent researcher, so you can't necessarily get access to the subscription-based articles. So this way, everybody's going to be able to have equal access to the articles. So that has to improve research generally. Breakthroughs often come from unexpected places. So again, open access is going to expand the number of potential collaborations and contributors. So you might have one idea of what your research is going to be useful for. Another researcher might have a totally different idea. It could be in a totally different field. So again, the broader the audience, the better. Funders, they're putting their money in to advance human knowledge and improve lives. So again, the more people that can access that, the better. Sharing of ideas. Best ideas remain just that until they are shared, until they can be utilized by others. So that's very important, to share the ideas. There's, again, not much point in doing your research, putting it into a journal, and nobody reads it, and nobody benefits from it. And here's just I suppose, quick graphic of produced by our excellent guide. This is a Maynooth guide. You can have a look at loads of great details on the benefits of open access and generally everything about open access. But these are just some of them. More exposure for your work. Practitioners can find your work, higher citation rates. And this is just the idea of, higher readership. And logically, that should lead to higher citation rates. I'll talk about more of that in a second. Influencing policy. Public can access your findings. Taxpayers are getting value for the money. Again, a lot of this is publicly funded. And researchers in developing countries can see your work. Again, very important, this whole idea of the north-south divide. A lot of publishers or academics in third world countries or developing countries wouldn't necessarily have access to work behind paywalls, so it's important for them to get access. Right, just quickly again, some issues to consider in deciding where to publish. So if you decide to publish, you're deciding to publish whether open access or somewhere else, these are some of the things you might want to consider: visibility, cost, prestige, speed of publication, and subject bias. So visibility, open access is going to increase your visibility, no doubt about it. And that in turn will improve your profile and that of Maynooth. So that point of view, well worth doing that. There's going to be higher downloads, higher visibility generally, and from that you should get more citations. Potential collaborations, again, people can find your work, there's more chance you'll be asked to collaborate on different projects. And democracy, very important that. It's democratization of research. Your data will be available to other educators and the general public, most of whom don't have access to expensive journal subscriptions. So you're dispersing your ideas, boosting your knowledge, and more immediate access for teaching. Again, people teaching worldwide are going to have access to your work. So very important. And I have quite a few, I suppose, sources for that in there that you might want to have a look at in your own time. You can link through them. The cost, can be quite expensive for the traditional, if you're going the gold open access route. Again, depending on where you're publishing, huge variation in cost, but it's quite an output. So if you're publishing open access, you're not going to have that. Like in some cases, you might have it from your funder might pay that. Occasionally, colleges might pay it, but generally, you'd be paying it yourself. And of course, what's happening there is you're providing your knowledge for free or paying to get it published open access. The traditional method is if it's behind a paywall, the university libraries have to pay to get it back, so it's kind of a double dip. Huge cost for academic institutions to access their own research. So I think the more open access we do, the better. These are just some of the charges that publishers have. Again, varies greatly on where you're publishing, but quite extensive. And particularly say if you're in the humanities and you don't necessarily have funding, it's quite an expense to start paying for open access. But things are changing a bit. So this is just the transformative agreements I mentioned that Maynooth were involved in. This is also happening in the US now as well, and they're referring to in this article to various deals that have been struck around Europe. There's one in Germany, Project Deal, but there's lots of European agreements, including the one that we have in Ireland that Ireland negotiated. So you can have a look at that as well. However, there is also talk of, while this is all very well for, I suppose, the North, where things are quite wealthy, there's still that two-tier system that, that we are still, obviously, we're paying the subscriptions, and that's combined with open access, but still a problem for the southern areas of the world that aren't going to have funding to be paying gold open access, or paying article processing charges, or paying subscriptions to journal for that matter. So they're still being excluded. So I think there's still work to be done on the whole side of open access side of things. Now, prestige. Traditionally, I suppose people would go for a high impact journal, and typically they're going to be gold, if open access, if they are at all. And they're going to be the journals that are in Scopus and Web of Science, and they're also the journals that are going to be pushing into university rankings, and that maybe academics want to get published in for their prestige. Sometimes the open access journals are a bit newer, so they might not necessarily have that prestige. So that's just something I suppose you'd have to think about yourself. If a particular journal is very important for your career, maybe that's where you have to publish. But ideally, open access, I think, is the way to go on that. But it's something I think that is changing. Prestige again. Again, open access, some of them can be very prestigious. For example, in biology, some of the PLOS ones, very prestigious. BMC Biology, ELIFE, they'd all be in the top rankings of impact. But again, with those as well, there is a fee involved in those. So they're not, I suppose, true open access in that sense. You're still paying something to get published in them and to make your work available open access. There's that brand name thing. If that is important in your field, you'll have to, I suppose, weigh that up. And can be subject dependent. For example, arts and humanities, the impact factors can be quite low. So it mightn't be necessarily as relevant to the humanities. But again, you might have to think about, do you go for strictly open access, or traditional journals, or hybrid versions of that. It's just something you'll have to weigh up yourself. Again, these are just more impact factors for biology. Speed, this might be relevant. Open access can be quicker. And in this survey here, 70% of science authors thought speed was very important. You can imagine if you're publishing in the sciences, getting your work out there quickly can be very important for your work. Peer-reviewed journals, there could be delay in submission. You know, again, problematic in the sciences, you don't need those kind of delays, so speed is very important. And traditional method of paper publications can also create delays. So for example, they need to create issues and so on. So again, some of the open access journals, that isn't so much of a problem. You might be published quicker. So if that's important, you might need to consider that. Again, a bit more on speed. Again, +1 peer journals. Okay. So subject bias, just quickly. There's no doubt, you know, a lot of these impact things, open access is more entrenched in the sciences. It suits them better. Open access emerged in the sciences. They get higher funding, so they can afford to pay article processing charges. You know, and the science funders are really pushing open access. So that's the big push is coming from the sciences. Humanities, you're going to have less funding to pay article processing charges. There is a struggle with maybe some of the learner societies, whether they can afford to go open access. That's something I think they're going to have to work on. I think ultimately it is going to be a value to them, but it's still being discussed. You might want to publish in journals you know and trust rather than newer journals. You're probably going to be publishing more monographs, book chapters, you know, maybe more national related, more independent scholars, less collaborative. So there is quite a difference between the sciences and humanities. So again, it's just something you're going to have to, I suppose, weigh up when you're deciding where to publish. So these are just some of the sources. So just to stress, very good Maynooth guide on open access, where you'll find a lot of what I've been talking about, a lot of other things as well, and you know, Maynooth's institutional repository mural, how to deposit your work in there, who's going to advise you on that. So well worth your while having a look at that, and then just other material on choosing whether to publish open access and how to publish open access. Okay, and that is my contact here. So I'm happy to take queries at any stage. If you have any questions about that, I know it's a bit of a charge through a lot of different ideas, and this has been recorded, so you can go back and browse it at your leisure. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me.